Okay, prior to our discussion of web protocols, I wanted to go through a quick history of the World Wide Web. This is actually a lecture that I created for my Unix system administration class, and I updated some of the numbers, but this gives you some background on the web. So we'll start back in 1989. In March of that year, a guy named Tim Berners-Lee proposed what he was calling hypertext to be used at CERN, which is where he worked, and it's the world's largest particle physics laboratory. So he made this proposal to his boss, and it was rejected. In 1990, he recirculated that document, and later that year, his boss buys him a NextCube, and he starts working on a GUI using the NextStep operating system. And he made up the name, the World Wide Web, for the project, and that's where www comes from. Just kind of a quick sidebar. If you're not familiar with Next Computer or the NextStep operating system, this is basically what Steve Jobs did for the 10 years that he was not at Apple. And the University of Kentucky was one of the top installations in North America. I can't remember where we fell, but we were in the top 10 as far as the number of Next machines deployed. Here's a picture of his NextCube and his monitor, and that kind of beat up sign on the cube says, "This computer is a server, do not power down." So that's where he was running the first web server in the world. This is what the interface for NextStep looked like. And he is running his World Wide Web browser and showing a couple of web pages. So in November 1990, this was the first web page that was placed on the internet. So he had his NextCube at CERN /hypertext/www/theproject.html. And that was pretty quickly moved to a new web server, info.cern.ch. And unfortunately, that web server is no longer on the web, but I was able to find a copy of the first web page from 1992. So this is what the first web page looked like. You know, very just basically text and hyperlinks. In 1991, he wrote a command line browser. So if you were on the Unix command line, you were able to surf the web. You know, not real pretty by today's standard, but it was functional and kind of state of the art in 1991. In 1992, November, about a year later, there were 26, quote, reasonably reliable servers on the internet. So it had grown from the original web server or two at CERN to a total of 26. In 1993, there was a piece of software that was written by Mark Anderson, and it was called Mosaic. And in the early 90s, mid-90s, Mosaic was a very popular web browser. In April of 93, CERN declares that they were basically going to open source the www technology and that it would be freely available to anyone that wanted to use it. In October of 93, there were approximately 600, quote, known HTTP servers or web servers. And also a line mode browser called Lynx was released by the University of Kansas. I still use Lynx today. The big advantage of Lynx is it's a command line browser. Pretty functional, but when you used to work remote and you were dial up on a modem, you didn't have the bandwidth to run X Windows or any graphical user interface. So if I was at home wanting to install some software on a server or a machine on campus, and I needed to download that software, I could use Lynx, and it would work pretty efficiently. Go to a website, find the software, download it, and then from there install it from the command line. In 1994, Mark Anderson and some other people left NCSA, and they formed what was known as the Mosaic Communications Group, and that is what later became Netscape. So Netscape in the 90s was one of the most popular web browsers. So they formed their company in March, and in December of that year they released Netscape 1.0. And in the end of 1994 there were 3 million internet hosts and about 10,000 websites. The web browser Opera was released also in 1994. I don't know how much use Opera gets, but the good thing about Opera, and one thing that I always say, is if your web page will work and render correctly in Opera, you're pretty much guaranteed that it will work in any other browser, because Opera is very, very strict at enforcing the rules. A lot of web browsers are very forgiving, like if you forget a closing tag, that type of thing. Opera will complain about that, so it kind of makes sure your code is as close to perfect as possible. In 1995, that's when Microsoft released Internet Explorer 1.0. In January of 97, a couple of years later, NSCA declares that Mosaic is outside the scope of their mission, and they cease supporting and developing that. In 2004, Tim Berners-Lee is knighted by Queen Elizabeth. And then we've kind of seen this before. The version I talked about a couple lectures ago was more up to date, but it kind of shows that almost exponential growth of hosts on the internet. And as we talked about before, when the first web page came out, that growth continued to continue upward. As far as web servers, for the first approximately 15 years, here's that growth. We also have a very steep upwards growth of websites. And continuing on past 2006, we see this growth going up. For some reason, the slide is truncated, but that top number is 1,800,000,000. And it takes a year or two for them to get the stats. So the most recent accurate number I could find was 2019. So that's a brief discussion of the history of the World Wide Web and how fast it grew, just like the number of hosts on the internet.